You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C., and welcome to all our participants and, of course, our speakers today for this a very timely and interesting program on rivalry and resilience, ASEAN and regional order in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you for our ongoing series of Indo-Pacific seminars. And today we have not only a great topic, but two extraordinarily distinguished speakers. Our main speaker, who will be launching the book today, is Dr. Amitav Acharya, who's a professor at American University. This book, ASEAN and Regional Order, Revisiting Security Community in Southeast Asia, builds on a previous book called Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia. It has been one of the top ranked and cited books on the Asia Pacific. And so we're delighted. He's a well-known figure in academic circles. He has led many distinguished studies, books, and professional activities. And we're delighted to have him here today. The discussant today is also an extraordinarily distinguished person, Ambassador Dino Patijalal. He has had so many posts, it's hard to know where to stop. He has been a candidate for the presidency of the Republic of Indonesia. He has been a special advisor to the president of Indonesia. He's been Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's been ambassador in Washington. And as many of you know, he is leading an extraordinary initiative called the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. And so is thereby active in civic and social life across Indonesia. So we're delighted to welcome you all the way from Bali and appreciate you staying up late. Pak Dino, great to have you with us. So without any further ado, because we want to maximize our 60 minutes, let me invite Amitav to share his presentation and speak for no longer than 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to Ambassador Jalal for some comments as well. Amitav, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Please allow me to share my screen for a moment. Okay. Thank you very much, Satu Lemay, my good friend. I mean, it's really an honor for me to be invited to speak at the East-West Center, even though virtually, to share my new book. And also Pak Dino for kindly agreeing to be the main commentator. Now, since I live in Washington, you probably have a chance to see me again, but I think Pak Dino should have more time to share his views. So I would try to be more brief, just introduce the book and tell you where to buy it, but won't really go into a lot of details. I'll be happy to answer questions during Q&A. So very quickly, this book evolves from a previous book, which is Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia, which gone through 3 previous editions, first published in 2001, second in 2009, third one was 2014. And this is actually, in that sense, the 20th anniversary of the first edition of the book. Same publisher, same series. But instead of doing a 4th edition, I decided to cover the basically what has happened in Southeast Asia from 2014. But this is a self-contained book in terms of it also summarizes the ASEAN's long history in one chapter, which probably is easier for policymakers and those who don't have a lot of time to read the previous editions. This 3rd edition is a massive book. It's like 300 pages, but you can get a summary of what has happened since until 2014 from this first chapter of this book. But in between these 4 iterations of this book project gives you an intellectual history of ASEAN, or policy history of ASEAN, because the 2000 book, all this history of ASEAN from 1967 to the present. And a personal gratitude, if you go back to look for this, This event today is in keeping with a Washington tradition for me. Every time I write a book, I launch it with the East-West Center with Dr. Satulimai. So this was in 2009, and this when I arrived in Washington, and for my current job. And on the right side was the last time I launched a book, also with East-West Center Washington with Dr. Limai in 2017. So thank you again for doing this once again, launching my book. So this has become, as I said, a Washington tradition. One very other quick point, this Constructing a Security Community in Southeast Asia is now the most cited book in the world in Asia-Pacific international relations. We just had a survey done of all the books published on Asia-Pacific IR, and this book comes out as the top by a long margin, by the way. And you can, I'll be happy to send you the reference to that, where the survey was done. So this has had a lot of influence, a lot of academic influence, but also policy influence. The first edition of the book came out in 2001. And in 2 years after that, Indonesia proposed the ASEAN security community idea. And what I have heard from Rizal Sukma and Yusuf Anandi, who are involved in drafting that Indonesian proposal, they consulted this book quite extensively. In fact, some of the early versions of the Indonesian concept paper had cited paragraphs from this book, which they were kind enough to share with me. So it has had policy influence as well as academic influence. I dedicate this book to Kunsurin Perchuan, who needs no introduction to those of you who follow ASEAN. He was, of course, ASEAN Secretary General, and also before that, the Thai Foreign Minister, a very close friend, mentor. We traveled a lot, and this was a picture taken in 2011, just outside of Jogja, after the volcanic eruption. And he passed away, unfortunately, very young in 2017, and I dedicate this book to him. So moving on, you know where ASEAN is, just to give you a sense of where the 10 members of ASEAN are. Also in the Indo-Pacific region, very important to keep the geography in mind, because it's linking Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but also China and India, the intersection of our Chinese and Indian interaction and influence. And not just current, but historically, going back to 2000 odd years, plus years. This is ASEAN's founding. Just to give you a flavor, this is what the foreign minister of the 5 countries looked like. They signed the declaration in Bangkok in 1967, August. And this is a picture of those 5 members were Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines. And of course, ASEAN was joined later by Brunei, and then Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. And Myanmar. I don't want to go into this, but I think is one point about evolution of ASEAN, that ASEAN's evolution or survival was never taken for granted. So the first, almost like more than a decade, 67 to at least 76, it was basically about survival and stagnation. At one point, the Malaysia-Philippine dispute over Sabah, ASEAN stopped meeting. So ASEAN's death was predicted then, as it is being predicted by some today. But then ASEAN actually built its confidence through conflict. So ASEAN actually built its resilience, which is one of the things we're talking about, not because it had a very favorable atmosphere, geopolitical atmosphere, but actually through conflict, through hard work. So this is important because a lot of people, especially if you are a realist, and Professor Michael Leifer, who helped me to write this book, I owe a great deal of debt. The second edition was dedicated to him. He used to argue that ASEAN has been lucky because the United States provided a security. Singaporeans used to say, Lee Kuan Yew, that the United States military presence is what maintains stability, and that allows ASEAN to flourish. But I think the problem with that view is that if you look at the history of ASEAN, there was no guarantee. This was that ASEAN will survive. and even if this 67 was not a great time for our U.S. presence in the region, the Vietnam War, Nixon Doctrine, and then of course we had the U.S. withdrawal from Indochina. But it was not really U.S. presence was absolutely not predictable. Think about 69 Nixon Doctrine. Think about the uncertainty of U.S. withdrawing from Saigon, Vietnam. How could you predict that U.S. will provide security at that time? I used to have this debate with my friend Bilahari Kausikan all the time that don't give U.S. too much U.S. presence, not U.S. presence, too much credit for ASEAN survival. It was this really managing the crisis, the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, and in between 79 and 89, that ASEAN built its confidence. Then we have ASEAN's golden age after the Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia and the Paris Agreement, and ASEAN really had the best time of its life in some ways, especially until the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Then a lot of setback, a lot of uncertainty, especially with Suharto out of office, Indonesia not taking leadership in ASEAN the way Suharto did. And so people thought ASEAN, again, going through a big moment of crisis or maybe even survival issue, survival challenge. But then it renewed itself, and a lot to do with Indonesia, SPY's government that Pak Dino served, 2003 in the ASEAN security community, and the three communities indeed, socio-cultural security, political security, and economic. So ASEAN kind of not only pulled back, but actually revived itself quite well. But then, from 2009 or 2011, especially after the U.S. joined the EAS 2010, 2011, and with the rise of China, intensification of U.S.-China rivalry, ASEAN faced a new set of challenges. And this is a challenge, but also a crisis of expectations, because during that time, ASEAN has built up so much responsibility, has acquired responsibility, not only managing Southeast Asia security or trade, but Southeast Asia environment, pandemics, development, everything. And then ASEAN has become the so-called center, or had the driver's seat of Asia-Pacific, or now Indo-Pacific security architecture, and creating ARF, or acting as the hub, or the principle of ASEAN centrality came up at this time. So being at the center of EAS, East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum. So the expectations are kept on piling up, and ASEAN lacked the capacity to massive, both human capacity, human resources, very small secretariat, very little limited funding, but also all these other things coming up at a time when U.S.-China rivalry was really increasing and intensifying. So we are in that situation now. Some pictures, I would just mention 4 of ASEAN's main achievements very briefly. First of all, no armed conflict among the original members of ASEAN, not the later members, but the original five, despite coming very close sometimes to Singapore, Malaysia ties, where there has been a lot of tension, but no real prospect for conflict. And when current ASEAN members have had a conflict with each other, armed conflict, they were, at least some of them were not ASEAN members. So Vietnam, Cambodia, in that sense, doesn't count, because their conflict happened when neither of them were ASEAN members. You can talk about Thailand, Laos in the same way. The only exception to this will be Thailand-Cambodia conflict over pre-Bihar. And it is a conflict, but it's not really, a major conflict with hundreds of deaths and casualties. And it was also contained both by Indonesian diplomacy, but also by the International Court of Justice arbitration. So ASEAN actually is a security community to the extent that its members, original members, have not fought a war with each other. And also all the members since becoming members have not really had a serious confrontation that qualifies by the definition of armed conflict by SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. A key role in the resolution of Cambodia conflict that really got ASEAN prominence, credibility, transforming relations with Vietnam, within a few years of Vietnam withdrawing from Cambodia, it went from being number one security challenge to ASEAN or threat to ASEAN to being a valued partner and even a leader of ASEAN. This is a remarkable demonstration of how enemies become friends and a key attribute of a security community. Then, of course, engaging all the major powers of the world. So ASEAN is a regional organization which has a global footprint. All the members, all the great powers of the current international system are actually linked to ASEAN, either as dialogue partners or as members of as members of East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum. And the European Union is a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum. So this is quite unprecedented. Other regional organizations have followed this. African Union, OAS, especially African Union now has dialogue relations, but they're very similar to ASEAN. They came much after ASEAN started this process. And even then, it's not as formalized, as regularized as ASEAN's is. So this is the one regional organization that actually regularly, in an institutionalized way, engages all the great powers of the current international system and the middle powers like Australia and Canada as well. So a very remarkable feature and achievement. Okay, so this is my main, I'll take just 10 minutes on this and we conclude. Where is ASEAN going now? I believe that there will be relative stability in bilateral relations within ASEAN. I don't see prospect for a war or arms race. A lot of people talk about military arms race among ASEAN members. There is an arms race going on in Asia or Indo-Pacific, but that's not among ASEAN members. That's between US and China or Japan and China. So at the larger level, and you can say that ASEAN countries are buying weapons with an eye to China, but it's not an intra-ASEAN issue. Authoritarianism and democracy, well, you know about populism, the Myanmar coup, but it is unfortunate, but it's not surprising. ASEAN has never been a club of democracies. On the contrary, it's begun life as a club of dictators. And as Sukuman Parivatra, Surin's deputy foreign minister, former governor of Bangkok, used to actually say that. ASEAN is a club of dictators. That's how it started. So when people talk about populism, it's news in Europe. It's news in the United States. It's not news in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia and ASEAN have never made democracy a condition of membership. And it's a group of newly independent countries, except Thailand, which is never a colony, and they're always going to have populism. But this populism with nationalism is part of ASEAN's makeup from the beginning. So yes, unfortunate, but nobody should take democracy in the region for granted. But I don't think it is a fundamental shift from where ASEAN was before. And there have been positive news. There have been transitions to democracy in Indonesia, which is still holding quite well. Malaysia went through a change of government at least for a period, and had they stayed together, not fighting among each other, Anwar and Mahathir, they would have probably survived as a more pluralistic democracy. So it's a mixed news in that sense. Far more challenging is non-traditional security. This has always been the case: economic, environmental. There was SARS, and now COVID. There was tsunami, and piracy, people smuggling, drug trafficking. To me, these are actually, in that sense, much more serious threats to ASEAN, aside from the great power rivalry, than interstate or intra-ASEAN military conflict. Now, great power geopolitics is important, but we have seen that it is also volatile. I mean, people always love to talk about the rise of China. In 2000, books were written about China's charm offensive, and I was kind of living in Singapore and said, this is nonsense. China's charm offensive is not going to last. It's a good policy. I hope China will go back to that, but it will all depend on how China follows the norms of ASEAN. Some people say that China is teaching ASEAN norms. China, I actually thought it was the other way around always. ASEAN taught China how to socialize in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the 1990s and 2000. China learning from ASEAN as much as ASEAN learned from China. But China's soft power has declined. Just what I had said in my 2001 writing, that it's a very transient. Soft power is very transient, by the way. Same for United States, same for China. So let's not make too much out of this concept. And United States has a window to reverse the Trump damage, which I discuss quite a bit in the book, and I will come back to it a little later towards the end of the presentation today, because Trump's was a very unusual period and very erratic period, like everything else in U.S. foreign policy during his time. And Biden has an opportunity, if he seizes it, to actually make up for that. The Indo-Pacific concept is a kind of a conceptual and a geopolitical challenge to ASEAN, because even though Indonesian Foreign Minister Marty had his own idea of Indo-Pacific, but this current Indo-Pacific idea is driven by 4 powers which are not ASEAN members. They're all outsiders from ASEAN's perspective. So, US, Japan, Australia, India. So this is the kind of situation where ASEAN is facing a geopolitical concept it had no role in formulating, especially look at the strategic version of that, like Quad, for example. So this is definitely a challenge to ASEAN. But on the other hand, I don't think Indo-Pacific will turn out to be a fully fledged military alliance. So it will be a geopolitical concept that ASEAN has to deal with, but it's not going to be the new SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization of the 50s and 60s. ASEAN is not taking sides. I don't buy the line who people say that ASEAN is moving from hedging to bandwagoning with China. My consistent view has been it will never happen. So ASEAN is going to talk about co-engagement, engaging all the powers, because that really suits ASEAN's strategic purpose. It's not normative, by the way, or moral to engage all the powers. It's actually quite strategic to be able to engage everybody, and in that sense, a little bit of a playing off one against the other dynamic, which is not uncommon among weaker and less powerful states in the international system. On regional institution building, I think ASEAN community is steady. The larger institutions are weaker. ASEAN Regional Forum and East Asia Summit, they are weaker than they used to be 10 years ago. And the loss of ASEAN centrality is happening, is eroding. But on the other hand, there is no alternative platform to ASEAN because great powers of the region cancel each other when they propose a new regional organization. So anything proposed by China is not acceptable to US, Japan, or India. Anything proposed by US is not acceptable to China. China is very hostile to Quad and Indo-Pacific. It sees it as a containment strategy. But it also won't be, anything that proposed by Japan or India is also not going to be acceptable to China, and vice versa. So in that sense, ASEAN is the only kind of neutral ground, honest broker kind of in Southeast Asia. So I will move on to conclusion now. I think this trust in China and US is very important. Many of you who follow Southeast Asia who know the annual survey done by the Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore, which used to be called just Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. And actually I had confirmed, this book was submitted in October, November before the survey. So I had actually said in the book, and I didn't have to change anything, that China's not only soft power, overall influence will decline. Mistrust of China will grow, and it will have a trust deficit because of what has happened during the pandemic. And that's a lot of my book discusses the COVID impact on ASEAN, how ASEAN, at least the ASEAN elites perceive China. So the so-called trust deficit indicator, confidence in China to do the right thing in the interest of global community. In a sense, the little confidence and no confidence measure increased from 51.5 to 60.4 in 2020 and to 63.4 in 2021. This is an elite survey, so should take it with a bit of caution. But on the other hand, elites do matter. I mean, they make foreign policy. So this is not totally, therefore, irrelevant in judging U.S.-China influence. The U.S., for the U.S., actually, a marked decline in distrust from 49.7% actually to 31.3% in 2021. The thing to remember is that when the survey was being done, it was clear that Biden is likely to win the election November, December. I mean, some of it happened after the November election. So the elites of Southeast Asia are already expecting that Biden will return, Biden will be elected, and the U.S. will have a better closer dealing with ASEAN. So they actually, that factor really influenced this particular figures. So it might change depending on Biden's policy, but it's likely to be better than Trump. So some pictures. Obama was a friend of Southeast Asia. Trump was seen at worst a nuisance, or at best a nuisance, at worst something else. Look at his presence in the only summit he actually attended in Manila 2017, ASEAN Summit. And then this is the last physical or in-person meeting, Bangkok 2019, that ASEAN held, where National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, don't blame him personally, caught a very lonely and sorry figure, where he was boycotted by ASEAN leaders for a US-ASEAN summit because he was not a cabinet level representative of US. Although 3 ASEAN leaders participated along with the foreign ministers. And this was the virtual meeting with the last administration. China, of course, as I said, I personally really don't think China has gained anything at the expense of US during the pandemic. I may be wrong about this, but that China has more sort of cards to play. It's closer to the region. It has economic cards. There is RCEP that China is a member. But in terms of trust, is different from transaction. So ASEAN's relationship with China is transactional, not based on trust. So you can have international cooperation based on transaction, even on a multilateral level. For Trump, the issue was that he was transactional but very bilateral at the same time. For ASEAN-China relations, it could be based on transactional benefits rather than kind of a community-based feeling. And that could be also true of the United States as well. So keep that in mind when you make big judgments about ASEAN is no longer hedging, but bandwagoning with China. China is taking over the region. No, I think ASEAN countries are more sophisticated than that. So let me conclude by showing this, which is on the cover of my book, ASEAN with the FIFA wearing jerseys. And you can say that even since 2019, governments have changed. Aung San Suu Kyi is in jail. So Mahathir is out. So this is a volatile region, and we should not take anything for granted. But some of the anticipation, I don't make predictions, some of what I've anticipated has proved out to be right in the past, and I hope it will be for the future. All right, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Amitav. Thanks very much for those insights and for the presentation. I hope you'll be willing to share the PowerPoint when we share the recording of the video for those who are joining us on YouTube or can see it afterwards and couldn't join us. Let me turn quickly now to Ambassador Jalal, who will make some remarks and offer his own insights from his incredible experience as a practitioner in the region for this important country of Indonesia and its role in ASEAN as well. Over to you, Pak.
It's good to see you again, and I miss our friends in Washington, D.C. I'm saying hi to them, and Amitav, it's always good to see you, and I want to commend you for your very strong intellectual leadership, especially on matters relating to ASEAN. And I want you to know that, I'm the head of the Indonesian Lecturers Association now in Indonesia. This is university lecturers. And you are a rock star. I'm not saying this to please you, but they're always asking, when is Amitav going to speak to Indonesian campuses and all that, right? So well done, my friend, and congratulations on your new book. And I hope it's going to be a $20 book and not a $100 book, yeah. Because and by the way, I'm doing this from Bali, and behind me is a door, and my 2 daughters are out someplace. So they barge in here, and you see two girls. Those are my daughters. I already told them not to barge in because I'm having but they may surprise me. Look, a couple of things I want to say. I only have 13 minutes left. One is yes, I totally agree with Amitav that I think one of the most incredible things that has happened to the ASEAN region is how much strategic trust has evolved among the members and how much relationships have been transformed. You know, I still remember during my childhood days how much we hated Malaysia, how much we wanted to destroy Malaysia, how much we hated Singapore, right? And there were other countries within Asia, Southeast Asia, that felt the same about another. Right? Now we regard ourselves as an ASEAN family, and those things are just way behind us. Southeast Asians are very good at turning a new page in the relationship. They're very pragmatic about it, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why the ASEAN regionalism is a success story. And my biggest surprise is not many textbooks, other than Amitav and others, a few others, really use this as a question: why can't this be used or be done in many other places around the world where you seem to have enmity relationships and it just lasts from one generation to the next generations? I mean, you see this in the Middle East and some other parts of the world, right? So congratulations for pointing that out, Amitav. And your book is titled Resilience and Rivalry, and I think ASEAN has shown its resilience. My biggest question mark, as somebody who lives in the region, is that why ASEAN is having a hard time grassrooting, right? ASEAN, in my view, remains quite an elitist organization. Despite the calls that now ASEAN has to be a people-centric organization and so on and so on. But really, in Indonesia, I would say less than 1% of the population know what the ASEAN economic community is or what the ASEAN Charter is. And even 1%, that's about 2.5 million people. That's still a high number, right? So I think, maybe except Singapore, because Singapore people tend to be more knowledgeable about regional affairs, including ASEAN. But in most of ASEAN countries, I think knowledge about ASEAN is very limited. People tend to think that ASEAN, they know about ASEAN, but they don't know much about it. And in Indonesia, I was surprised to learn, for example, that out of 36 provinces in Indonesia, only a few actually trade across the border with their ASEAN neighbors, even though they're just across the border, right? So ASEAN really, I think, one of the biggest challenge is not just resilience, really, but it's grassrooting the organization. The way the European Union is actually grassrooting itself quite strongly and affecting a lot of the daily lives of the Europeans, right? Another thing I want to mention is, ASEAN was an experiment, obviously. The founders of ASEAN did not know where this was going to go. They had an idea that they have to reform their relations in order to establish regional stability. But I think what made ASEAN grew in terms of its confidence is that a lot of the regional issues were resolved by regional countries itself, right? In other words, they did not sit around and ask Europeans, Americans, or China or Japan to resolve their issue, right? I mean, Indonesia and Malaysia had border issues, Sipadan and Legitan, that was to resolve between them, right? And there were a number of issues. I cannot name them one by one. But they were resolved by ASEAN itself, and I think that added to the sense of confidence in the value of their regionalism. One concept that Amitav talked about this a lot in his book. One concept that has really become quite prominent is the ASEAN centrality, right? Why is this important? Because ASEAN understands ASEAN cannot shape regional order in South Asia or in Middle East or Northeast Asia and things like that. But ASEAN can shape regional order in Southeast Asia, right? Where it aspires for a central role in managing regional affairs. Now, ASEAN centrality is not just about convening power, and it's more than just about neutrality. I was reading the news about the recent summits that President Biden had in Europe with the EU, with NATO, and there's one more, I forget. And from that summit, it was very clear. The result was, hey, China, keep off, and you're now our systemic rival. Russia, stay off. We're going to have a different kind of relationship, right? We're going to maintain European unity vis-a-vis these countries, right? And this is obviously something that you can do in Europe, but what makes ASEAN unique is that it can never play that game, right? The ASEAN game is that ASEAN needs to get along with all sides, right? And sometimes this is not well understood by external powers, but this is the game, right? ASEAN centrality is about embracing all sides, and when we do this, this is the best way that ASEAN can be effective and impactful, right? I think in some ways, ASEAN centrality is probably a 21st century form of non-alignment, of regionalized non-alignment, right? So it's very important to understand that it's ASEAN protects and jealously guards its centrality, right? And I think there's a feeling of some degree of insecurity in ASEAN these days about in centrality when they see regional dynamics, right? They see the Quad, for example, and questions are being asked, how does this impact ASEAN centrality? And that question has not been answered clearly and so on. So that's about ASEAN centrality. On China, look, I agree. Amitav wrote in his book about China's adaptability, right? And I do want to underscore this, that I sense this and I experience this, that China has international engagements and on some countries, especially the United States and the West or Japan, they're hard, right? But when it comes to Southeast Asia, they're incredibly flexible and adaptive, right? They may not look like they like criticism, but they hear them and internally they process them, right? I mean, one of the most surprising meetings I've had when I go to China every year as part of the China Policy Group of Indonesia. The most interesting talk was with the Chinese Communist Party, because the questions were all about, hey, what do you think we're doing wrong and how do we fix it? And the questions were like, hey, please be as honest as possible. What things do we do that you're not comfortable with? We don't want to make this mistake and so on, right? So I thought, whereas the officials were more rigid and official, right? So I found it really interesting that they wanted to honestly look at what they're doing so that they can do it better. But I think they do this more for Southeast Asia, right? I think with the United States, they tend to be more defensive, more rigid, right? But when it comes to Southeast Asia, because for a number of reasons, they tend to be more open. Southeast Asian, I think, understand that to deal with rising China, we have to accept that China now is different than what China was 20, 30 years ago, which means what? China does have ambition, right? And we accept that, right? Rising power, every rising power does have ambition. China does feel a sense of entitlement regionally and globally, and we accept that. Why not? The United States have that, and it's not a sole right of the United States, right? So, we feel, yes, you have entitlement and ambition, and you probably have exceptionalism also, and, we accepted American exceptionalism. And I think when the Chinese begins to show it, to be honest, we say, I think that's a normal part of rising power, right? But I do want to say that despite what Amitav said about the surveys that he quoted, and I've read that survey. I also agree with his other point that look, in the last 4 years, the United States under President Trump lost a lot of diplomatic and political capital. Right, President Trump was just seen as erratic, not reliable, not respectable. Right, and my President Joko Widodo has not visited President Trump in the White House, and vice versa. Right, and President Trump's policy towards ASEAN was just seen as just not credible. Right, so now there's a good chance for Biden to reverse course. Right. Thing is, I don't have a few minutes left, but the only thing is that we're still waiting for the right and strong gestures from the Biden administration. The first moves undertaken by the Biden administration has not strongly recognized ASEAN, and there's been some blurbs which we know recently, and I don't think much of it, right? But the United States, I think, under Biden administration, does need to send a strong policy signals to Southeast Asia, to ASEAN. And why do I say this? Because the perception in the region is that China is very good at playing the long game, right? And the United States is not very good in playing the long game, because every 4 years, obviously, there's a new administration, or every 8 years, and things usually change, right? So one thing that I took note of, this is my last comment, I took note of Amitav's comment about U.S. influence vis-a-vis China, or China's influence vis-a-vis United States. But in my view, I think it's almost a certainty that if you look at the next 4 years, and I'm talking very pragmatically here, China's power and influence in Southeast Asia will grow a lot stronger relative to the growth of U.S. power, U.S. influence in Southeast Asia. And I'm talking about political, diplomatic, and also economic, right? And perhaps even social, also social and cultural, right? China is very good about engaging the political infrastructure in Southeast Asia, and public diplomacy of China is unmatched by the United States, unmatched, right? I know it because I'm on the ground, I'm on the grassroots. Chinese diplomats, Chinese public diplomacy programs are just huge, right? And they embrace everybody. They embrace political parties, political leaders, religious leaders, the youth, and many groups in ways that is hard to be matched, not just by the United States, but by Japan, by Australia, or by India, or by others. Right? So maybe I'll stop there, and then we'll get into discussions.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. As always, very thoughtful, incisive comments by you, based both on your knowledge of the region, but also your practice of diplomacy over decades. So thank you very much indeed. I want to, there's a couple of things I want to ask. We have a limited time, and then there are a couple of chat questions, both around the issue of Myanmar. But I do want to ask both of you to comment a little bit on ASEAN's role, where, the book is called, has as part of its title, ASEAN and Regional Order, You've written and both practiced and written about security issues in Southeast Asia. I wonder if you could say a little bit about ASEAN's role or no role regarding the South China Sea issues. What do you see going forward for ASEAN? And then picking up on that, because we're trying to look at two case studies of how ASEAN could play a role. The other questions were in the chat were about Myanmar. What, if anything, we're all aware of what has been done by ASEAN so far in the meetings, but I wonder if you could comment both on these two case studies, one within ASEAN and one sort of within ASEAN, but involving a number of extra ASEAN actors. Why don't we start with Amitav and then turn to Ambassador?
Perhaps I would answer the Myanmar question and leave Pak Dino to answer the South China Sea, although there is a section on my book on South China Sea. On Myanmar, the first point is not surprising. This is my last visit to Myanmar, giving a talk in the Mandalay Puppet Theater, and you can look at the back of my screen, the puppets. They gave me a puppet in return for my talk, one of the puppets hanging, and in my back of my screen, you will see that puppet standing there. I followed Myanmar very quickly, very, very closely. And this is what I had written in October 2020, before the coup. Says that in Myanmar, one cannot rule out a dramatic reversal of the already fragile democratization process in Myanmar, resulting in a military return to power, resulting in the military's return to power. I mean, this was pretty much predicted, by people because when I spent a lot of time in Myanmar from 2011 to 2018, there was one thing about power sharing, if in our constitutional change, and I told this to the previous government through my contacts, that if you try to push too hard on reversing changing the constitution, and whether it's to make Aung San Suu Kyi the president or whatever, this is going to be a whatever you call, not only a red flag. This is like this is not going to be acceptable, so that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that why ASEAN faltered. Well, my personal view was that ASEAN should not have invited the junta leader to Jakarta unless there has been a previous ASEAN delegation going to the region, going to Myanmar, talking to the military leadership, but also Aung San Suu Kyi. So I think I understand President Jokowi had good intentions, and they felt that they could co-opt the Myanmar leader by giving him a bit of a pace. They did not call him the president of a leader of the country. They still call him the military commander, but that was diplomatically not the right thing to do, in my personal view. But ASEAN is also seriously divided. So as you know, it's a question of which countries are, Thailand is under military kind of regime.
Sure.
So the domestic politics also matters. They are looking at how this is going to be handled by ASEAN. This might come back to haunt them one day.
Thank you, Amitav. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on ASEAN's role on the South China Sea, given the current state of play?
Well, obviously, the most important arena now is the negotiations for the code of conduct, which has been delayed. And that sort of worries me because when it's being delayed, how do we make sure that nobody takes advantage of that delay to shore up their positions in the South China Sea, which is quite likely here. But definitely we've seen stronger pushback by ASEAN towards China because more ASEAN claimants, but also Indonesia has made their positions more well known on the tribunal ruling. When the tribunal ruling came out in, I think, 2016, if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia agreed with it, but we held back, right? But more recently, we made our position known and deposited our position at the UN. Certainly, there is more concerns about what's going on in the South China Sea, and whether or not the code of conduct will deliver a meaningful document that will be binding and that will establish rules of conduct in that contested areas.
Thank you. Now, we only have 5 minutes left, so I do want to pose a blunt question to you. Ambassador alluded to China's growing role in the region, likely to continue for all kinds of reasons that he stated, diplomatic. The Biden administration is just beginning, to get to its Southeast Asia policy. Amitav, you didn't say much about the US. Since this is a kind of a Washington, D.C. hosted program, though people are joining us from all over, may I ask if you had a couple of recommendations to make to the Biden administration about its approach to ASEAN, not a particular country or a bilateral relationship? What would they be? Because it seems likely that the November meetings will be virtual, more than likely, given the current state of COVID. And there are a number of issues at play. I wonder if you could make some specific suggestions regarding whether it be economic statecraft or diplomatic statecraft or new initiatives for the region. I'd love to hear from you both. And this time, Amitav, could we start with you?
Yeah, very quickly, you asked for two. First, stop ideology. Stop pushing for ideology, democracy. I am sorry to say this, but this is basically one area where it's going to be alienating, given the political differences among ASEAN countries. So less ideology, whether it is criticizing China and promoting, pushing the ideological offensive against China that Pompeo was trying to do, or in ASEAN, but more economics. So less ideology, more economics. And second, more diplomatic engagement. I mean, all these things, the main reason why U.S. influence went down in Southeast Asia under Trump was because of lack of diplomatic engagement. And this can be done not only at the presidential level, but at all kinds of levels. So we can talk about it, but those are the two things I would say. Can
I ask you, Amitav, before we turn to Ambassador, I mean, I hear this often from good friends and colleagues in Southeast Asia, don't make it about ideology, if indeed one thinks of it in those terms. But there is, we're on the line with a former senior official of a very democratic country that has now gone through 4 presidential transitions. There's a lot of support for democracy amongst the people and civilians across the region, as was evident in Myanmar and elsewhere. So I wonder if the U.S. appeal to public diplomacy is partly an appeal to the representation of people. Wouldn't that be consistent with a message of true public diplomacy? At the end of the day, no amount of scholarships and fellowships will be useful if you're not aligned and supportive of the large mass of the citizens of the region. Am I wrong here?
Couple of things here. I make a distinction between human rights and democracy. I'm all for promoting human rights abuses like with the Rohingyas or anywhere. But democracy is a little different because there is no perfect democracy. Vietnam is not a democracy. US has pretty good relations with. India is a democracy but has human rights abuses. Those two have to be separated. Secondly, I'm not sure that many people are calling for democracy. They want to be protected against abuses. Again, I went to Myanmar under the military rule in 2006-07 and told them that to focus on democracy, you cannot abuse people's rights. Whether you are a democracy or not, I'm happy to wait. So could we just have that nuance rather than put democracy, human rights under one umbrella?
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification, but I would still put that less ideological and more in the nature of representation, the exact form of representation being certainly open to local conditions and views. Let me close this program, this fascinating program with these two speakers, with Ambassador Jalal. May I ask you to comment on maybe your thoughts on what the U.S. could do as the Biden administration, enters its full first year, and how we could engage with Southeast Asia as we look towards the fall traditional summits?
Well, I'll definitely first get your U.S. ambassador or permanent representative to ASEAN Secretariat as soon as possible. You know, it's been vacant for some time. Show up at meetings. Showing up is always a good way to show commitment, especially because the U.S. is getting a reputation as a superpower with fluctuative engagement in Southeast Asia. And I agree with Amitav that look, like Lee Kuan Yew used to say, economic engagement is really at the heart of the diplomatic weight, right? So if you want to, that's how China came in and became quite influential in the region. They used the economic door to come in and establish their relevance. And the United States problem is they're not part of CPTPP, they're not part of RCEP, and they don't have currently a regional economic scheme of significance, right? So they got to catch up. But one last point, Indonesia and the United States is now trying to recalibrate its strategic partnership, and climate change is at the heart of it now, right? So I think United States has strong competitive advantage on climate change issues, on green growth and sustainability. So I think that may well be an angle that would be very attractive to Southeast Asian countries, especially Indonesia.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time has come to 10 o'clock and we must close. I do want to flag for our viewers before turning to a sort of formal thank you that we have several programs coming up. I hope you'll join us for our newsletter or our events newsletter. And we have a series coming up on North Korea's relations with the Global South, including last week we did Vietnam, and there'll be other Southeast Asian countries covered. So many of you are interested in Southeast Asia, and we'll be having a terrific lineup of programs on North Korea's relations with the region and with the Global South more broadly. I want to, before closing, just once again thank Amitav for launching yet another book. I'm always on the platform waiting for his next assessment of the region. So Amitav, thank you once again for taking the opportunity to work with us on launching your book. And as always, our very distinguished Ambassador Jalal, it is great to see you again. Thank you for taking time from Bali. Your daughters did not come into the room and disturb you, but I'm sure they're eagerly waiting outside the door to have their father back. So thank you for taking the time. Truly appreciate it. Yeah. Be healthy, be safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again for an East-West Center Indo-Pacific Center.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Amitav. Thank you, Satu.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Okay.
Bye-bye.